Good evening. The other night I talked about doubt, and tonight I want to talk about what might almost seem like the opposite end. I want to talk about fixed views and freedom from fixed views. The Buddha's teachings on freedom from fixed views. And my interest in this, my talk, is inspired by a line in the Metta Sutta. The Metta Sutta, that one that says, "So with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings." Long sutta that really is the basis for our loving kindness practice. And the end of it has just always struck me because these are the last few lines of it. It says, "This is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, being freed from all sense desires, is not born again into this world," meaning into this world of suffering. So this is said to be the sublime abiding. By not holding fixed views, the pure-hearted one having clarity of vision. It just sounds like such an awesome promise, the sublime abiding. It's sometimes translated as by not trafficking with views or not being taken with views. And is often the case in our Buddhist teachings, it can be something of a paradox, because wise view is just the first of the path factors. It's the first of the teachings on, here's how to organize yourself. Here's how to orient yourself when you're on the path to freedom from suffering. It's, Indiana Jones's map. It's like step one, wise view. And so there's wise view, and then there's the sublime abiding of not holding fixed views, and kind of how does that work? And so it requires a bit of inquiry and really depth. You can't just sort of read it and go, yeah, okay. We really have to kind of contemplate, what did the Buddha mean by this? By both of these things, really. So I want to talk about views, fixed, and freedom. Freedom from fixed views. And we'll start with views. I mentioned the other night, just the biology of how views develop in our human organism. We use views to come to make sense of the world. Our conscious mind makes contact. The sense organs make contact with some form. Feeling quality arises. It's pleasant. It's unpleasant. It's neutral. And there's a perception. There's a oh, that's what this is. And then there's the sort of the storyline. There's the narrative. There's the coming to understand how things work and what this is and what it means. And the brain uses, as we develop as children, the brain uses ever more complex conceptual capacities to do that kind of organizing, so that we have a greater and greater capacity to kind of get a sense of how the world works and how to navigate it fluently. So from the moment we're born, we begin to represent our experience mentally and to organize these representations into more or less choreographed dances or narratives and stories, each complete with its own cast of characters and program narrative, So we make these movies about life. I could say to you, vacation. and the movie starts rolling, doesn't it? Anything, mom, war, whatever, and the movie starts rolling. So it's just how it works for us as human beings, and this little organism thing that we get as part of the program. And the point here, though, is that all of these programs are constructed. We fabricate them. We make them up. Partly from the internal lizard who is trying to be safe and in control of what is in fact a tenuous and ever-changing world. Just our kind of lizard brain, our automatic reflexes of safety, and partly secondary to the unique aspects of the particular programming circumstances that we find ourselves in, whether we're born in, Colorado or Sri Lanka, whether we're, fundamental Mormons or, Hindu, whatever, that those, whether we're Republicans or Democrats, those kinds of circumstances really are part of the programming system for these constructed programs. And so we all end up with slightly different programs. Even if I had a twin, my twin would have a slightly different internal program just because experiences are by definition somewhat different. So all of us, no matter who we are or where we are, have greater or lesser discrepancies, among us in these constructed programs. It's just how it is. It's just how it is. But nevertheless, these programs help us to move through life in a more or less organized way, while at the same time helping us to eliminate the need at every moment to examine anew the details of what's going on and to make every single moment to have a novel decision. We kind of know, I say the word vacation, and I say prepare for your vacation, and we kind of already kind of have a sense of, okay, we kind of already get a trajectory of what needs to happen, or make an airline reservation or whatever, So they help us navigate. But nevertheless, because they're constructed programs, they're not reality, the mind leaps to conclusions and in the process is no longer really able, the mind is often no longer really able to be mindful of what the actual experience is, what's actually going on. And it can move into action and reaction that is ignorant of the reality of the situation and harmful to oneself or others. And we, please raise your hand if you've never had that experience, of moving quickly into action or reaction in a way that really wasn't so wholesome. Nevertheless, it's normal and natural that we do this. It's just how the human organism functions. So it isn't like views are bad or wrong or, we shouldn't have them or something like that. Or they should all be the same or something like that. It's just not how it works on this planet. Maybe it's different on Mars or something, I don't know. But on Earth, it's just how it works. Left unattended, though, obviously the mind can get us in trouble. And the Buddha talks about wrong views. And here it gets a little tricky and a little paradoxical. We have wise view, we have right view, we have wrong view, we have fixed views. What is he talking about? So the Buddha often speaks about wise view, or right view. The translation matters, so I'll say right view and wrong view. One of the translations is right view and wrong view. And really, quite often in the suttas, we come across something where the Buddha is teaching about right view and wrong view. And basically, he's teaching us, how to use our minds, which we already know. I mean, we know from sitting in practice that our practice is a mind training. So he's talking about right view and wrong view. And in the suttas, we sometimes read about unwholesome views, even erroneous, mistaken, or wrong views. And it's easy to see how we could have a wrong view of things. You know? I was reading to you last night the interview with the astrophysicist. He says, we only know, maybe 4% of physics. That's only physics. So there's so much we don't understand that if the mind is determined to make things up in order to make us sort of secure and safe, that it's easy to get that the mind can make things up in a kind of convoluted way, in a way that actually doesn't quite jibe with how the world actually is. So there's such a thing as an erroneous or delusional view about how life works. We all know the story of Galileo. The Earth is the center of the solar system. And when Galileo first looked through the telescope and said, I think that's a wrong idea about things. I don't think that's true. He was very heavily persecuted, and indeed couldn't get people to actually look through the telescope. He said, look, just look, you'll see what I'm talking about. And he couldn't even get them to look through the telescope because they were so convinced that their view was the correct one. And we can have, all sorts of, quasi-delusional views, like the laws of gravity. I have a nephew who follows this one. The laws of gravity do not apply to me, There's a Peanuts cartoon I have where Lucy is mixing red and yellow paint to make green. These kind of delusional views that we can make the world work in our own way. We can grow apples from turnip seeds. So the Buddha in many places speaks about views that are simply erroneous, especially with respect to those aggregates I talked to you about. Especially with a sense of, it is possible that form is permanent, that physical forms are permanent, or feelings are permanent, or perceptions are permanent, or consciousness. Especially he talks about, wrong views, that we have these views that things are permanent. We have views that there can be a human life without dukkha, without suffering. We have a view that we can control how things unfold. That we're basically in charge of the universe. It works in a number of ways. One of the harmful ways that it works is that when we see the suffering in the world, we see the suffering in Syria or climate change or something like that, we feel really responsible that I single-handedly am in charge of these causes and conditions, and I single-handedly have to make it better. And it's a wrong view. We're not in that kind of control. I have a greeting card. Some of you have heard me talk about this because I like it so much. That says, the front of it says something like, I can't remember exactly, but it's things I've learned. A universal remote control does not, in fact, control the universe. And then inside it says, I decided not to get you a universal remote control for your birthday after all, because believe me, you would just be disappointed. But we think we do, don't we? We think, we think we do control the universe. We think we can control the universe. So those are wrong views. Those are those are the Buddha is saying. I thought I had this thing fixed here. There we go. So the Buddha is saying, just those are wrong views. You have to let go of those views if you want peace and freedom, because it just isn't like that. And then he talks about right view. And the Pali word for that is samaditi, meaning, and it means most often seeing the truth of suffering, the truth of impermanence, and the truth of these multiple causes and conditions, the truth that we're not in control. Samaditi. And that is often translated as right view, but it gets a little sticky to have it translated that way, because there's a problem that we have, maybe especially in the West. When somebody says, you're supposed to cultivate right view, it's sort of like, well, don't tell me what to think. It's sort of like, it feels like there's sort of like a list of rules or something like that. Or some kind of constraint about how you're supposed to think or how you're supposed to do, how your mind is supposed to work. And that isn't what the Buddha meant by right view. And Ajahn Amaro helped me out on that. He said that the word sama in Pali really is better translated not as right, but as balanced or in tune. He said it originally comes from the word that meant to tune a lute, to tune a musical instrument. And apparently a lute is somewhat challenging. It takes about a day to tune a lute. But to kind of really listen to it and bring it into real clarity, bring it into a line. So right view is really referring to a balanced view that is in tune with how things are, with how things work. It's not that I'm correct and you're incorrect, but being attuned to what's happening now, inside, outside, listening deeply, making space for it, not reacting according to its pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral qualities, but responding wisely with a really broad perspective. Really being able to see like a big picture, and at the same time with precision, skill, and wholehearted kindness. So this kind of, it's like really how to make beautiful music, how to really tune the mind so that it sees clearly and can respond with a very wide perspective and wholehearted kindness. And in most other cases, he speaks practically of views that are either useful or not, that do or do not get us where we want to go, which is, of course, in his teachings, freedom from suffering. This is the Buddha. He says, the well-instructed disciple of the noble ones discerns what ideas are fit for attention and what ideas are unfit for attention. This being so, he does not attend to ideas unfit for attention and attends instead to ideas fit for attention. This is the key part. He attends appropriately. This is stress. This is suffering. This is the origination of stress. As we look directly at our own experience, this is the cessation of stress, and this is the way leading to it. So we look directly at our own experience. We know when something is or is not stressful. We look to see what we're holding on to that's causing it. We look to see where the letting go is invited. And we use the path to help us. He says, views are helpful insofar as they help us in that way. Because the only thing I really care about teaching is about suffering and the end of suffering. So from my point of view, the Buddha says, wise view, balanced view, is a view that leads to clarity about suffering, clarity about its causes, clarity about its end, and clarity about how to get there. Okay? is. When a person has right view, whatever bodily deeds this is the Buddha again, whatever bodily deeds he undertakes in line with that view, whatever verbal deeds, whatever mental deeds he undertakes in line with that view, whatever intentions, whatever vows, whatever determinations, whatever fabrications, all lead to what is agreeable, pleasing, charming, profitable, and easeful. Why is that? Because the view is auspicious. Just as when a sugarcane seed, a rice grain, or a grape seed is placed in moist soil, whatever nutriment it takes from the soil and the water, all conduces to its sweetness, tastiness, and unalloyed delectability. Why is that? Because the seed is auspicious. He says, in effect, if you want to grow apples, plant a good apple seed. If you want freedom from suffering, start with a wholesome, balanced view of things. Attend appropriately. And so to make sense of this, we just need to understand that the Buddha is a very practical scientist. He's not worried about esoteric things, or at least about teaching them. It's not let us think up a bunch of rules or shoulds or even beliefs about things, but how does this life, this consciousness, this mind, this self actually deeply work, and how can I align with that? How can I be in tune with that? And he asks us to ask that question. He says, Ananda on his deathbed said, is there anything you want us to do? Do you want anybody to take over after you're gone? And he said, but Ananda, why are you even asking me this question? I've never tried to control the Sangha. You guys practice and let what happens come out of that. He said, I'm only interested in suffering and its end. I'm not interested in controlling you or telling you, this is the right way. I've offered you the teachings. Look to see, in any given circumstance, how it works, what applies, where is suffering, and where is its end. This is Walpola Rahula. He says the freedom of thought allowed by the Buddha is unheard of elsewhere in the history of religions. This freedom is necessary because, according to the Buddha, man's emancipation depends on his own realization of truth and not on the benevolent grace of a god or any external power as a reward for his obedient good behavior. He also talks about some ideas that really, some ways of thinking that really won't get us there. So he talks about inappropriate attention. I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but just to, you'll come across that in the suttas, and he talks about, he says, basically this sort of don't go there. You're spinning your wheels. It won't help. It won't lead to freedom from suffering. We abandon, and he has a whole list of ways of abandoning unwholesome views, unwholesome ways of thinking, by seeing them, by restraining them, which is don't spend your time thinking about that. It's just not helpful. Using things appropriately, like clothing or food or medicine, just kind of looking to see what's a wholesome use of these things. Tolerating weather, flies. Isn't that funny? It stops raining and now we have flies. It's always something. He talks about avoiding wild horses, wild dogs, unsuitable environments, thoughts of ill will and cruelty. I think of avoiding certain media. Some of the stuff that's on television. It's like, oh my goodness. that it's just not likely to lead to the end of suffering anytime soon. And developing factors in our minds, qualities of our mind. He lists the 7 factors of awakening and invites us to develop those: mindfulness, investigation, energy, joy, concentration, tranquility, equanimity. He says develop these because it will strengthen your mind, so that you'll be able to discern what's wholesome and what isn't. So again, basically, ideas, views are wholesome or not, according to the Buddha, depending on whether they help one to know this is stress, this is the origination of stress, this is the cessation of stress, and this is the way leading to the cessation of stress. That's all he cared about. That's all he wanted to teach. So we look for ourselves to see what works and what doesn't. And he told them all they needed to know so that they may bring suffering to an end. Releasing, cultivating wholesome views and releasing unwise views. And then there's the thing about fixed views. What on earth does that mean? It says, this is said to be the sublime abiding by not holding fixed views. So, a little bit of reflection reveals that even with these amazing teachings, we can have very definite views about how things work, how things should work. And we can have very definite views even about what the Buddha meant when he said X, Y, or Z. We can have very specific views. And so it can result in the amazing paradoxes of hostility and war in the name of goodness. Just really quite remarkable. I just came back from France and was in the Languedoc region, which is a region in southern France where one of the earliest and most vicious Catholic crusades was waged against a religious group that had different beliefs, slightly different beliefs from what the church taught, and also, by the way, didn't like the fact that there was corruption in the papacy. So this incredibly vicious persecution in the name of faith, in the name of Jesus, in the name of loving, the loving message that he offered. But we actually don't have to look that far away, do we? We can kind of go tisk, tisk, they shouldn't have done that. It was really too bad. But we don't have to go that far. We can, in our own lives, in our own media, we can look at, people going to war over the care of animals. It's just amazing to me that people will kill humans in the name of protecting animals, or, destroy a lifetime of scientific work in the name of protecting animals. We can go to war over what foods to eat, or what medicines to take, or even how to practice meditation. There are all sorts of places where we find that we can have very definite views about how things are, how things work, how things should be done, and indeed even how to end suffering. We certainly see it, don't we, in the world of politics these days. Oh my goodness. People are really throwing views at one another. My way is the right one. And in more ordinary ways, just here even, we can have definite views about what sorts of foods we should eat, meat, not meat, chocolate, not chocolate. Should they put pepper in the salad dressing? We can have just all sorts of ideas, and actually feel quite strongly about them. That obviously this view is a correct one. I don't know what is wrong with the rest of the world that they don't see that. how people should dress, how the retreat center should operate, what they should do about the cats. I have a couple of views about that. There's a story I heard about a Zen retreat where people were getting kind of rigid in their views, and the abbot of the monastery one evening had the cooks serve hot dogs and potato chips and Coke. So if that comes up tomorrow, it'll be my fault. And so we cling to views. We kind of make these views, even wholesome ones, like what's wholesome food, and how to care for animals. We even wholesome views, but then we kind of start to kind of cling to them and start to solidify them in ways that they become fixed and weapons of destruction. He who understands clinging and non-clinging understands all the Dharma, the Buddha says. He who understands clinging and non-clinging. Clinging and non-clinging. But we can actually kind of feel, can't we, when we think about considering something that I have strong views about. Racism. Certain political views, something I have strong views about. How the forks in my kitchen should be arranged, something I have strong views about, When we start to touch into our own views and the views that we have strong views about, and we start to inquire then, he who understands clinging and non-clinging understands all the Dharma, we begin to see where this enters into our practice. And we begin to see, the possibility of confusion. Does that mean I shouldn't care about, how things unfold? I should just say, well, that's how it is. There's just racism in the world. It's just how it is. Is that what that means? So how do we navigate that? The Buddha, in one of his teachings, I hadn't realized actually that the story of the blind man and the elephant was actually a story that's in the suttas. It was a story that the Buddha used. I don't think it was his story. I think actually it might have been a fable that was before then. But anyway, it's presented in the story as his relationship, or his telling a story about one of the kings who lived in his times. And the tale is generally well known. The king, he has his administrator bring in these blind men, and he puts them all in different places of the elephant, and then he has them tell, what an elephant is like. And one says it's like this, and one says it's, it's got a bushy, it's got a little bushy thing and it wobbles around, and the other says, no, it's really hard and kind of, very solid, and the other one is like down at this end, it's kind of, wiggly, and it's wet at the end, and so that there's just sort of all these different views about how it is, and then the blind men start to fight with each other about what an elephant is like, because the king has asked them to tell him what an elephant is like, and so they start to argue with each other. It sounds like our Congress, doesn't it? They start to argue and fight with each other about what an elephant is like. So we kind of know that part of the story. But what's not generally well known is then the sutta goes on. And the point the Buddha was making by telling the story is less commonly recognized. We do understand that any single thing can have multiple different components and perspectives, and that our understanding of anything in particular, is going to be limited by the extent of our own direct experience. We kind of get that piece. But the king was actually encouraging this kind of conflict for his own amusement. And actually, when I think about that, I think about my reading of the Washington Post in the morning, in which articles I read. And it's not so different, really, being amused by the struggles back and forth. So the king was doing it for his own amusement. And this is Andy Olinsky. It's a little bit long, but it's sort of useful, I think. Andy Olinsky commenting, he has a commentary on the sutta. He says, the Buddha told this story in response to a conflict between many teachers of different traditions living in the same vicinity at the time. Not only did they all have differing views, opinions, and beliefs, but they also depended upon these differing views for their livelihood. And it may not entirely surprise us to hear that they lived arguing, quarreling, and disputing, stabbing each other with verbal daggers, saying the Dhamma is like this, it's not like that, and the Dhamma is not like that, it's like this. And Andy asks, does any of this sound familiar? What the king seemed to know is the extent to which views, beliefs, and opinions in human beings link directly to very primitive instincts for defending what belongs to oneself and attacking what is regarded as belonging to others. I actually think, by the way, my personal opinion is that that's why this is happening in our politics these days, that 9/11 really left us feeling so incredibly vulnerable that we're still reeling from it and still needing to kind of assert some quality of separateness and safety by being incredibly belligerent and self-assertive. He says, what the king seemed to know is the extent to which views, beliefs, and opinions in human beings link directly to very primitive instincts for defending what belongs to oneself and attacking what is regarded as belonging to others. The whole enterprise of creating belonging as part of our construction of reality, along with the sense of self to which it all belongs, is perceived by the Buddha to be the root cause of the suffering we inflict upon ourselves and others. It is one thing to have a difference of opinion with someone else. It is something else entirely to have this difference become the basis for stoking the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. It is natural that most issues are complex and that people will have different perspectives on them. It is also inevitable that most perspectives will derive from a limited range of experiences and are unlikely to embrace the whole. It may be further understandable that people express their differences of opinions, engaging in mutual dialogue and debate. What is utterly unnecessary, the Buddha seems to be saying here, is that such differences need to escalate to stabbing each other with verbal daggers, striking one another with fists, and worse. At that tipping point, something profoundly unhealthy happens as primordial mechanisms of aggression and defense kick in. By the way, that also happens between ourselves and ourselves. Once this happens, the original content of the dispute is lost, and the impulses of the self take over, the need to establish oneself, defend oneself, aggrandize oneself, and generally attack and injure anything viewed as not in agreement with oneself. The problem, as usual, is not with the content of our views, but the process. So the solution is to be found not in what we believe, but in how we hold those beliefs. I wrote it again on the next page. So the solution is to be found not in what we believe, but in how we hold those beliefs. The Buddha taught clinging as the problem, and one of the things we cling to most diligently is our views about things. It's not a problem to have views. How we think things work, how to be in tune, how to keep the organism, in Dan Siegel's words, flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. But to know this is reactivity, the fixed views that the Buddha, that's a mistake, forget that. But the fixed views that the Buddha invites us to investigate and root out, we can learn to see that and not take them quite so seriously as truth. John Tarrant, he says, the with condition is what, in an unexamined way, you believe to be true. Beliefs have consequences. They build their own functional world. When you believe something, you usually want want the world to agree with you, to back up your story. Of course, it rarely does. So your story will come with some conflict built into the plot line. In the without condition, you see the world without wanting it to be different from the way it is. The without condition is an act of imagination. You ask yourself, what would the world look like if I loved it as it is, just as it is? The power of imagining life when you are not depending on the stories you usually tell yourself. It can show you what life is like in the with condition when your maps of the world vary from the actual territory of the world. So to let our actions, any actions that we take, come from that place of what would the world look like if I loved it as it is, just as it is. So it's not about not acting. It's about what would the world look like if I loved it just as it is, and I paused to see what action flows out of that love, and not an action that flows from clinging and insisting that my view is the whole or complete or correct one. So the Buddha proposed that by releasing the tension, the stress, the clinging of holding, we're going to be able to discern more clearly, actually, what is in fact happening. What is in fact happening internally and externally. To see what our options in fact are for action. To see what in fact I am capable of doing. And then to be able to execute that with the fluidity of a tuned lute. So the Buddha is inviting us to learn to tune this human instrument, this human body, to not hold fixed views which would render the instrument unable to detect and tune to what is happening now and what is needed here and now. The issue is not what we think or what we do, but a different layer. What is underneath? What is the position, the perspective, the attitude with which we think and do what we do? Ajahn Amaro tells a story that Ajahn Sumedho tells about himself. Ajahn Sumedho was the Dharma era of Ajahn Chah, who is, in many ways, one of the major fathers of the Western form of Buddhism that we practice. And Ajahn Sumedho was one of the senior monks in a monastery in Thailand, and there was a Thai monk who was uncharacteristically for a Thai, but he was very kind of loud and uncouth and unspoken, and visitors would come and he'd kind of gab away with them, and he kind of scandalized the visitors, and they'd go scurrying away, and he was just kind of a general nuisance. He was just talking all the time. And it just kind of annoyed Ajahn Sumedho. And he couldn't understand why Ajahn Chah wasn't doing something about it. Why he wasn't correcting him and telling him to behave. This thing is kind of strangling me, is what's happening. Telling him to behave better and to be quiet and observe silence and all those groovy things. And he just couldn't understand why he wasn't doing that. And so he waited, actually, until Ajahn Chah was away, Ajahn Chah being the senior monk of the monastery. He waited till he was away, and they have a gathering where they sort of, come together in the monastery, and they talk about, what's going well and what's not going well. And in this gathering, Ajahn Sumedho kind of called out the Thai monk. He said, "You're doing this, visitors are leaving, and it's because you're so unskillful, and you shouldn't be like this. And when Ajahn Chah comes back, I'm going to talk to him about it." And the monk was so humiliated by what happened that even before Ajahn Chah came back, he just packed up and left the monastery. And so when Ajahn Chah came back and Ajahn Sumedho had talked to Ajahn Chah about what he had done, Ajahn Chah scolded him. He said, "You were right in fact. This person was being unskillful, but you were wrong in Dharma." The practice is to practice Dhamma according to Dhamma. And he said, you were wrong in that. You behaved in a way that was unwise and unkind. Ajahn Chah said, "You intended well, but what you did was very harmful. His mouth is evil, but his heart is good. This was the one place this man could stay and practice, and now you have closed the door. He can't stay here because he was shamed in public. So you were right in fact, but you were wrong in Dharma, because it was coming out of his anger and not out of a loving heart. So it didn't work. So the principle of practicing the Dhamma in accordance with the Dhamma, seeing how the mind gets caught in these, kind of various fixed view states, and then just takes over, and seeing where the release is. I want to tell you a story, so I want to skip some things so I can tell you a story. All right, good enough. Because in this moment you are either creating more suffering for yourself and others, or you're not. How can this process be ended? Tanisaro says, through a shift in perception caused by the way one attends to feelings, using the categories of appropriate attention. As the Buddha states, rather than viewing a feeling as an appealing or unappealing thing, one should look at it as part of a causal process. When a particular feeling is pursued, do skillful or unskillful qualities increase in the mind? If skillful qualities increase, this feeling may be pursued, or action, or thought. If unskillful qualities increase, it shouldn't. So to really look, to be a scientist, to be like that astrophysicist who's really looking, he says, I don't know, really, but who's really looking to see, how does this work? And the invitation is to cultivate that capacity, to have that kind of inquiry moment by moment, 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 by moment for us. So I wanted to tell you a story. I actually had 3 stories. I broke it down to one. Because I sometimes am just so inspired by people who do this well. And I kind of collect them. I love collecting stories of people who do this sort of thing well. And this comes from a book, you may know it, Tattoos on the Heart. You know that book? It's a book that is written by Father Greg Boyle, who has for 20 years worked with gangs in Los Angeles. This fly really likes me a lot. So it's basically, he's basically, working with ISIS, in terms of the caliber of the difficulty that he's working with. He's working with the worst gang population in the city of the United States that has the worst gangs. So he's working with the worst of gangs in Los Angeles, and he's done this for 20 years. And what he does is he is able to practice this kind of wholesome view, not holding fixed views, which isn't to say that he doesn't have views. He gets it that these guys are being incredibly unskillful, and he's on them constantly to, for example, not kill each other, constantly. When they commit a crime and they come to him, he says, "I'll drive you to the police station. Are you ready?" So it isn't that he's being stupid about it. But he is able to hold this view, this perspective of these people as loved and beautiful human beings. It's a totally awesome book. If you haven't read it, it's great bedtime reading because it's just so completely awesome. And he talks in the book about his struggles with it, but he's constantly talking about the love with which he is holding these people. And really, it's as though he was living with ISIS for 20 years, and he loves them. So I want to read to you just a little bit about the tone of the book, that you can kind of get a flavor of this. And after working with these groups for quite a while, he realized that what they needed was jobs. And so he decided that first they tried doing plumbing, and then he said, who knew people don't want gang members in their houses? And so he started a bakery, so that they could have jobs and, learn how to behave in civilized society. And so they had this bakery. And in 1992, Homeboy, it's called Homeboys, these gangs are called Homeboys. Homeboy Bakery is launched, but 7 years later, in October of 1999, it burns to the ground. He says, "I must admit, initially I thought it was arson. When I say this, people often presume I mean that gang members did it. I never thought that. Homeboy Bakery stood as a symbol of hope to every gang member in the county. That they would destroy this place of second chances didn't make sense. But we had lots of enemies in those early days, folks whose views were narrow, who felt that assisting gang members somehow co-signed on their bad behavior. Hate mail, death threats, and bomb threats were common. We used to joke during this period of hostility that emanated from those who opposed the very idea of Homeboy, that with so much vitriol leveled at us, we ought to change our voicemail message after hours. Thank you for calling Homeboy Industries. Your bomb threat is important to us." From my office once, I heard a home girl answer the phone, and she says to the caller, "Go ahead and bring that bomb, motherfucker. We're ready for your ass." I ask her who's on the phone. She covers the receiver, nonplussed. "Oh, just some fool who wants to blow the place up." Kiddo, I tell her, maybe we should just say have a nice day and God bless you. The fire turned out to be faulty wiring, but of course we didn't know all this in the first half hour. And during this time of not knowing, a wizened Irish-looking fire inspector comes over to me. "You the owner?" he asks, flames shooting through the roof of the bakery behind him. "Yeah." he says, "You got any reason to believe why someone might have started this fire?" "No." You didn't have any disgruntled ex-employees, did you?" "No," I tell him. "All the disgruntled ones still work for me." I needed to break the tension, even if he didn't need to. He does not smile. "You know this area where the bakery's located?" He surveys it with a whisper, turning his head from side to side. "Well, it's known for hoodlums." Like this might come as a surprise to me. "Well," I tell him, "I think we're okay here, because at Homeboy Industries," now I'm the one that's whispering, "we only hire hoodlums." And then he goes on to say, he said, God would seem, he's a Catholic priest, so he's talking about God. "God would seem to be too occupied in being able to take her eyes off of us to spend any time raising an eyebrow in disapproval. This is a chapter on God, I guess. Truth be told, the whole book is. Not much in my life makes any sense outside of God." Translate, love. "Certainly a place like Homeboy Industries is all folly and bad business unless the core of the endeavor seeks to imitate the kind of God, love, one ought to believe in. In the end, I am helpless to explain why anyone would accompany those on the margins were it not for some anchored belief that the ground of all being thought this was a good idea." So he's talking here about God, but he talks constantly in the book about love and how much he loves these people, even the ones who themselves threaten him directly. This is a quote from a book on Suzuki Roshi. He said, "One day I complained to Suzuki Roshi about the people I was working with. He listened intently. Finally he said, 'If you want to see virtue, you have to have a calm mind.'" So we practice to cultivate calmness in the mind, not to obliterate views, not to fix them in some particular way, not to do away with wise discernment, but to allow a spacious awareness that closes nothing out of our hearts. Truth is not defined, as a quote, "not defined by political power nor by religious conviction. Jesus was not guilty of a crime merely because temple authorities and Pilate's sentence declared that he was, just as the sun did not revolve around the earth merely because the Catholic Church for centuries decreed that it did. Truth is not determined by human desire nor by human decree. Truth is the harmonization of the human mind and heart with what is." It seems necessary to say these things because all too often power, common opinion, and tradition are taken for granted synonyms for truth. Even the Buddha abandoned his fixed view. When he studied and traveled and practiced for 6 years and was at the point of death, eating 1 grain of rice a day. That was his belief, to suppress the desires of the body. And he was literally near death. And a woman came up and offered him a bowl of rice and milk. And he realized that, you know what I'm doing isn't working. It's not leading where I think it should. I'm going to let go of that view that I've, just so practiced so incredibly diligently with, all these years. I'm going to let go of that view because I can see that it is not working. It's not leading to the end of suffering. And so what he did was he ate and he gained, this is the night of his enlightenment, he ate and he began to, no, actually it wasn't the night, it was just before his enlightenment, but he gained the energy and the clarity of mind that when he did sit down under the Bodhi tree and Mara tempted him and threw all kinds of challenges at him, he was able to stay clear and see clearly what was needed, and he became enlightened. By kind of coming into this balanced way of not indulging in the rice and milk, not saying I can't be happy unless I have it, but at the same time not resisting what was sort of needed for the quality of clarity. So the real point there is just, what is needed for clarity? Where is suffering? Where is it? Where is the end of suffering? For in this moment you are either creating suffering for yourself and others, or you are not. This is Ajahn Chah. He says, we practice to learn how to let go, not how to increase our holding on to things. Enlightenment appears when you stop clinging to wanting anything. And once again, I'll end with a poem. This is a Mary Oliver poem, In Blackwater Woods. A nice poem for autumn. She says, look, the trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light, are giving off the rich fragrance of cinnamon and fulfillment. The long tapers of cattails are bursting and floating away over the blue shoulders of the ponds, and every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. Every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this, the fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes, to let it go. To let it go. So we'll sit for just a minute here.